Hello, writers, and welcome to another episode of Tea with Tara. Today on the show, we have a very special treat for you. We have Jan Turnquist, who is the executive director of Louisa May Alcott's Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts. Now, I don't know anybody who has not heard of Louisa May Alcott. She is famous for writing a little novel called Little Women. You may have heard of it. So anyway, we're going to get to talk to Miss Turnquist about Louisa May Alcott's family, how she became a writer, her views about feminism, and so much more. You don't want to miss this episode, so stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Tea with Tara. We are now joined by Jan Turnquist, Executive Director of Louisa May Alcott's Orchard House. Ms. Turnquist, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So I want to start by asking if you could tell me a little bit about Louisa May Alcott and her family life and where she was born.
Well, she was actually born just outside of Germantown, Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
And, yeah, her father had been hired by a Quaker gentleman, Reuben Haynes. The Quakers, as you may know, were very progressive. They believed in male and female equality in education. They were abolitionists, and just they all fit with Mr. Alcott's style. He was passionate about education. And when they heard about how he taught, absolutely not the way many of the schools were being taught, where children were being beaten all the time, and questions were frowned upon or maybe even forbidden because the teacher knows what you need to know and you just need to memorize. So Mr. Haynes hired Bronson Alcott. It was a wonderful start, but then sadly Reuben Haynes died. And so Mr. Alcott had to move on, and Mrs. Alcott's family had been in the Boston area. Mr. Alcott had been there before, and so they moved. And you have in the real family the same configuration that you see in Little Women.
Oh,
you have the four girls, and they move around a great deal, but ultimately the place they live the longest of anywhere is Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts. And that is really where they have what Louisa called an anchoring place. But prior to that time, they moved around so much because of Mr. Alcott's very progressive teaching ideas. He would start a school, it would be a private school, and people would often be excited, the children were excited, but then after a while, there would be something that would make someone nervous. They didn't like the fact that their children were encouraged to read so much. They're not getting their chores done, or they didn't like the fact that the children were never struck. They're going to be spoiled. At one point, these abolitionist parents came to Mr. Alcott and told him that the little black girl that he had admitted to his school, and she was a charity pupil because she didn't have the money, they said, well, either she goes or we take our children out. We're the paying parents. And he said she stays. So many things happened that required him to move on, almost always a matter of principle. He was very, very, very idealistic.
Now, what was her education like? And did that lead to her becoming a writer? Was there any specific reason?
Well, her father, even though he was teaching school, he was teaching other children, as I said, he was passionate about education. So his own girls had a great deal of education directly from Mr. Alcott. Sometimes other friends of the family were involved. Some of the girls went to school some of the time, but they were often learning at home and probably in a very much more advanced way. Mr. Alcott believed that keeping a journal was vital. It was part of your education. It trained you in writing. And all of the family members kept journals, all of them. And Louisa's journal was very important to her. So she early on did write a great deal. When she was only 8 years old, she composed a poem. I'm not going to recite the whole thing, but it starts out, it's very sweet. It's called To the First Robin. And it starts out, welcome, welcome, little stranger, fear no harm, fear no danger. And it goes on. It's a good deal longer than that. But it was so amazing for an 8-year-old. And this is Alcott said, why, she's going to be another Shakespeare. So they were really encouraging Louisa's interest in writing. Her youngest sister was passionate about art. And you probably, if you know Little Women, you're thinking, this sounds familiar. The second born daughter loves writing. The youngest daughter loves art. The child in between the writer and the artist is indeed very, very shy and dies young. And the oldest daughter, both in real life and in Little Women, is very thrilled about marriage and taking care of her children, becoming a mother. But she also loved acting and did a lot of acting with her sisters in the home. And by all accounts, she was a good actress.
But Louisa May Alcott was the only writer in the family?
Yes, I mean, they all kept journals, but right, in the sense of writing a book or really writing a lot. I think Mrs. Alcott was an excellent writer, according to what we see in her journals, but she didn't publish anything either. So Louise is the only one who went that direction to publish.
What was the family unit like? They were obviously very close.
Yes.
A lot of people assume from Little Women that because the father is not present in the book, that she was not close to her father in real life. And that's why that's incorporated in the book. But is that true?
Well, no, she was very close with him, but all that moving around, I mean, they moved approximately 30 times, 30. That's a lot of upheaval. And if Louisa had written the book exactly the way they lived, it would be constantly talking about, oh, father has to close his school, we're moving. He started a utopian community at one point. He was always trying things, always very idealistic. And often that's not the way you really earn money, if you're very idealistic and if your ideals take you far ahead of your time. Mr. Alcott's teaching principles are the ones that people use today, but not in the 1900s. I mean, in the 1800s, in the 19th century. So he was gone a great deal. Sometimes he was scouting something, sometimes he was lecturing. And all that moving. So I think what Louisa wanted to do is take the core of their family unit and focus on that. And the fact that the Civil War was so disruptive to so many people, and it made for a lot of poverty. And the real Alcott family did struggle financially. So she thought, what if I let father go off to war? And in the book, and that way people will understand why we're poor. They'll understand why he's not always home. Because if she's going to explain, for example, well, father his teaching ideas are so remarkable that there's a school in England that has been named for him. It was called Alcott House. And it was all based on his principles. And they invited him to England. And Mr. Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, wanted Alcott to go. So he goes off. You don't go to England for a week or two in those days. It's a big trip, and you're gone.
Yeah, right.
And so things like that were going on. How is she going to explain all that? It's just simpler to change time a little bit. Their young years were lived before the Civil War. In fact, it was Louisa May Alcott who went to war. She was a nurse in the Civil War. Her father was too old. He did not go. So she gives her father her war experience, because it would have been unseemly. A lot of people wouldn't have wanted to read about a female nurse. That was a little risque in a lot of people's minds, that just women.
And is that where the book Hospital Sketches comes from?
Exactly. That's a description of her experience.
Now, what about her as a writer? I mean, obviously her family was very supportive of her writing. Was this unusual for the time period? I mean, did families really, because we hear about Emily Dickinson, that her father really did not, unless I have this story wrong, that her father did not really encourage her to be a writer and rather discouraged her.
Right. The general feeling during those days was twofold. One, it's not ladylike. Women can write letters. You can be, literate, but you write your letters just to your family and friends, and that's all within the private sphere. If you're going to write for publication, you're putting yourself out there in the public sphere, and that's where the men belong. Women do not belong there. So that's unladylike to go and venture that way. And that's why a lot of people thought it was a bad idea. But the second thing that happened around that time is that there were physicians who, I don't know what kind of research they thought they did, but they felt they have proved that brain work such as writing would destroy a woman's health.
Well,
So you had two reasons it was a bad idea.
yeah.
Now the Alcotts were sort of iconoclasts all the time. They did not go by a lot of things that the public might be going by, and they did not believe that writing should only be for men. And
So thankfully, her parents did not think that way. And I think her father went so far as to build her a writing desk. Is that correct?
yes, it's in Orchard House, the very desk. It's built in between two windows in her bedchamber. And that is where she sat to write Little Women. Those words, "Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents," were written right at that desk. And her mother had given her a pen with a little note that said, "May this pen your muse inspire, wrapped in pure poetic fire." So she had tremendous encouragement from both her parents.
So is it true that she was told by, I don't know if it was an editor, or maybe you could correct me on this, someone told her, you better stick to teaching because there's no way you'll make it as a writer?
Well, one of the family friends, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, had brought the kindergarten movement into the United States. And this was before Louisa had had success as a writer. This, as I say, Elizabeth Peabody was a family friend, and Louisa decided, well, this is one way I can make money. I'll start up a little kindergarten. And a lot of these things were done as private enterprises. So Louisa goes into Boston to start up a little kindergarten. And she's fortunate that she needs to board somewhere. And James T. Field, who was, James Field was big publisher of that time. He published Dickens and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Hawthorne. I mean, he was a big publisher. So can you imagine how excited you are if you're a fledgling author and you are going to have a place to stay? You're going to be boarding in the home of one of the biggest publishers around. So that was her circumstance. So she has an opportunity. Oh, and by the way, one reason I think that she was boarding there is because he had a nephew, I believe it was, that they wanted to have in this kindergarten. So they were sort of helping her, and she was, helping them with this nephew. James Fields loaned her $40, which was a lot of money, because if you were starting your own enterprise, you had to buy things. You had to buy the desks or whatever equipment you needed. So, and you had to rent a place. So he loans her the money, and she starts the kindergarten, but she's writing all the time. And at one point she's slipping some things for him to read, hoping he'll get interested. And at one point, and I wanted to look this up for you. So I'm going to read to you this little thing from, it's actually from Louisa's journal of 1862. This happened earlier, but she's looking back. This thing that happened, this statement from James T. Fields, really never left her. She was not happy that he had said this. She says, I went back to my writing, which pays much better, though Mr. Fields did say, and now this is in quotes, "Stick to your teaching, you can't write." She says, being willful, she said to herself, "I won't teach, I can write, and I'll prove it."
And she did at that.
And she did. And it's not written up in this section, but she did go back later after the success of Little Women, after she was making a good amount of money, and she repaid him for that loan. And I can't recall if I actually read this, but I'm sure it must have been something like him laughing and and thinking how he had made a mistake. He
And
should
having
have
to eat
picked her up.
crow, right? What about Louisa May Alcott as a person and her decision to remain unmarried? Was that due in part to the responsibilities that she had to her family? Because she
Yes,
was the main breadwinner, correct? Once her writing got underway?
yes, yes. I think that was part of it. I also think really she just did not meet the right person. Now, but you're right. She was so busy with the writing. I don't know if she really would have been taking enough time to pay attention to meeting the right person if he did appear. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was her father's very dear friend and was her father's age. I mean, she would have been horrified if someone like that turned a romantic eye toward her, even if he were unmarried, which of course he was married. But she had what I think of as like a schoolgirl crush on him.
Right.
And that set the bar pretty high because Mr. Emerson was an amazing, wonderful person. And if that's your ideal, if a little girl has a crush on, let's say, a teacher at a certain age and he's wonderful and there are all these things, it sort of sets the standard. That's who she'd want to meet. And you have to remember so many of the men who would be the right age died during the Civil War. So I think it was a combination of factors. Now she was proposed to, and at one point she actually spoke with her mother. Should I do this? It's probably my last chance. And her mother said, no, you should not marry for convenience. It should be for love. And her parents, again, were supportive of her own decision in that regard. Whereas a lot of people would have said, yes, any marriage is better than no marriage, but they didn't feel that way.
Now, is it known whether she had a lot of friends that were female? Because I read somewhere where she said she really didn't have a lot of relationships with women as friends, or she didn't.
Well, growing up, they moved around so much. They did sometimes have little playmates, and she did play with other children at certain junctures. But she was such a tomboy. She loved doing what the boys were doing. She wanted to run. She was a very, very graceful runner and loved running. She liked to climb trees. She didn't mind jumping out. If somebody dared her, that was always a boy, to jump out of this highest loft, she'd do it because she wanted to play with them and they didn't want to play with a girl. But if she met their dare, then they'd play with her. So she played with a lot of boys, but she also did play with her sisters and she was so close with them. And the impression you're getting was when she was asked to write Little Women. She was asked to do that. And you mentioned hospital sketches. It really came out of that because hospital sketches was a huge success. It was the most success she had had to date because I think people were hungry to know what was going on in those hospitals. And it was written in an entertaining fashion. And it was widely read. And one of the people who read it was an editor at Roberts Brothers Publishers. And he asked her to write they called it reality writing. It was realistic. She changed names, and sometimes she'd put two characters into one to make the story move along faster. But the heart of it was true. The heart of it was what she had really experienced as a nurse in the war. So he was thinking, gee, maybe we should try that for a girl's book. Make it realistic because that was not a style. The girl's story, any of the books really were written, I guess you could say, very aspirationally, like, here's how you should behave, children. And Little Women is not that way. It's very realistic compared to the other books. So he asked her to do that, write a realistic girl's story. And she thought, I never knew many girls. What am I going to do? Except my sisters. Who'd want to read about them? I think was a little bit how she felt. And those of you who have siblings probably understand. If you're thinking about your siblings and somebody says, write about them, you might think, well, that's going to be a little dull. But they needed the money. So she goes ahead and gives it a try. And then, of course, as you know, it succeeded famously.
And how did she feel about writing the sequels? Was she equally not as...
The first sequel is really the second half of Little Women. And in some countries, in England, for example, it's still sold in two parts. And many people have read part one only, and they don't know that part two is now put together. Certainly in the United States and in many other places, part one and part two are together as Little Women. But at first, Little Women was separate, and the second half came out the next year, and it was called Little Women Part Two, or some places it was called Good Wives. We've had people get all excited. I've discovered a new Alcott book. It's called Good Wives. It's really just part two of Little Women. So she had already written that sequel. And the next book, Little Men, she wrote and gave the proceeds, the copyright, all of it to her older sister, Anna, who had just lost her husband. So that was for Anna's security. And people were still wanting more. And so she does ultimately, and much later, write Joe's Boys. And that was difficult. Her health wasn't very good. And she sort of felt like, I've got to wrap this up. And so that is the last sequel that she wrote. I don't think she hated doing it exactly, but it felt like, oh, I've done a lot.
Happy to put it behind her.
Yes, she was ready to be finished with it.
And did she write Little Women at Orchard House, at the little desk that her father built her?
Yes, she did. Now, like any writer, I'm sure there were times she sat outside on a bench, or she, but the majority of it, that's where she started. That was her writing place, and that was Orchard House, and that was part one. And there are all sorts of myths. There's a place in New York City where they say she wrote it. Well, she wasn't even in New York City. We know where she was. There's a timeline. She was never in New York City during those years.
So you already touched on that she incorporated so much of her own life into Little Women. How reflective was Jo March? Is Jo March reflective of Louisa?
Very much so. I think Louisa would say, yes, I am Jo March, but I didn't make her half bad enough. Louisa was trying to make sure it would sell books, which is another reason that you didn't want to have your nursing experience in there as a woman. I mentioned that. So she made it as palatable as she could. But yes, the temper and the love of acting and, the tomboyish characteristics, all of that was very, very much the real Louisa.
And is it true that she really didn't want Jo March to be married in the book, and that she started getting letters from readers saying they wanted to see her?
Yeah, part one and part two that I talked about. So when part one was published and so popular right away, letters did come to the editors saying, what becomes of the Little Women? Do they marry? And Louisa's, well, I'm paraphrasing, but it was sort of like, oh, as if that's the end and be all of a woman's life. Louisa just wanted girls to know she didn't have anything against marriage at all. But she herself was not married. And at one point, she was asked to write an article on spinsterhood, because a lot of times if you were unmarried at a certain point in life, you were really considered a failure. You're an old spinster. And that was not a compliment. And she wanted women to know that they are good people. They can stand on their own 2 feet and be considered an important contributing member of society without a husband. It's all right. You can do that. That's pretty radical for that era to have that point of view. So by having Jo March remain a literary spinster, which is how Louisa would describe herself sometimes, that would help set a role model for young women to say marriage isn't the only way. But the editor was Thomas Niles, who was really a good person. But he was firm on this point. He said, it'll spoil the book. When you go into part two, and there will be the marriages, Jo just has to marry. She's the main character. You can't have her not get married. This is terrible. And so Louisa kind of puts her foot down and she says, well, I'm not going to marry Jo off to Laurie to please anyone, because that's what everybody wanted. That would be perfect. People still get upset that Jo doesn't marry Laurie. But I'll make a funny match for my Jo. and she creates Professor Bear. She puts her father's teaching ideas into him. So she kind of has the last laugh that way.
You know, Louisa May Alcott's, the whole thing with her succumbing to the pressure about having to marry Joe, it kind of reminded me of me when I wrote my first novel. My protagonist was not married and not in a relationship. And I actually had somebody say to me, well, that's not right. She should be married. And I thought of Louisa May Alcott. I thought that no, she went through this in the 1900 or the 19th century. Here we are in the 21st century, and we're still having this conversation.
Yes, yes. Oh, I'm so impressed that you had that thought.
Yeah, that was the first thing I thought about.
I
wish Louisa May Alcott could be here and just, plead my case for me.
Well, I think she's smiling on you from somewhere. She would be very pleased that you felt that way. I wanted to say one more thing about this, if I can remember what it was. I might not. We can just keep going, and it'll come back to me. But I think that's a really, I know what it was. And I think you were wanting to get into it later, maybe you want to do it now, talking about how forward thinking the whole family really was, and Louisa was, as far as what we would today say was a feminist.
Right, because she really was a barrier breaker. I mean, she was a writer. She made the money. She went to as a nurse, but went to the Civil War. She didn't want to be married. She really lived her life.
Yes, and she was that role model for many people. I was so privileged to meet Gloria Steinem one time. And I was introduced to Gloria Steinem as the executive director of Louisa May Alcott's Orchard House. And, when you're meeting somebody famous and you're not famous, it's usually a very quick little, hello, nice to meet you, and on you go. But she stopped and she said, oh, I have read everything Louisa May Alcott ever wrote. And Gloria Steinem found strength and found Louisa a role model because of the way she was. And you're right, in that era, that was especially difficult for a woman.
Right. And I love one of her quotes is, I believe that it is as much a right and duty for women to do something with their lives as for men. So she was really ahead of her time.
Very much so. The whole family really was. Women, of course, didn't have the vote. It's an awfully long time till they get it. Louisa May Alcott, though, was the first woman to vote in Concord, Massachusetts for school committee. They made a decision that women could vote for school committee at town meeting. And you had to register, though. And there were women who didn't want to register because I wouldn't know who to vote for. I'd have to ask my husband. I might as well let him do it, which just dismayed her so much. But her whole family believed in the idea that women should be fully enfranchised. And her mother, one time, Lucy Stone, who was fighting very strong for women to have the vote, asked Louisa to speak at a convention that Lucy was having, and Louisa couldn't do it. So she was writing a letter to Lucy Stone, and her family was about her as she was writing. And she said, what shall I say? And I'm paraphrasing now out of my memory, but her father said, basically, tell her you're with her in spirit. Her little nephews, Anna's two boys, were there. They were very young, and one of them, they called her Aunt Weedy. One of them said, well, you tell her we'd let you vote, Aunt Weedy. And her mother said, tell her your mother intends to vote one day if she has to be borne to the polls on the shoulders of her daughters. So all of them were saying women can do these things. Women should vote. Women should write. Women should be able to do anything they put their minds to. So
because I think the assumption, nowadays, I've talked to other women who have said, oh, women in that era, they didn't know any better. They didn't want anything more than what they had because that's all they knew. Wife, mother, you're not expected to be educated. You don't have to read. You don't have to know anything. You just have children and cook, and that's your role. But with people like Louisa May Alcott, it's very clear that they were well aware of their role in life and didn't like the role that they were playing.
Exactly. Yes. there were a lot of women who were really sort of pushing against that. And depending on what kind of support they had or didn't have, would probably depend on how far they were able to move with their ambition. But Louisa was very fortunate for the support of her family and also just her own inner strength, because I'm sure she frequently had, people looking down on her for what she was doing, how she lived her life. And she just held her head high. And when I mentioned a little earlier that she was asked, I can't remember if I actually said she was asked to write an article about spinsterhood, about being an unmarried woman.
Right.
She entitled the article Happy Women.
So if she were alive today, bring her into the 21st century, what would she think about the women's movement today? I mean, would she be out there marching for Me Too?
Absolutely. I think she absolutely would. Yes. And I think she would be so heartened to see that it's strong now, stronger. I think she'd be a little bit disheartened to see that there are still people who, even in this country, but even more so in certain other countries, where women are not supposed to be educated, are not supposed to be able to be fully, shall we say, realized humans. The men can, and the women no. And Little Women's been translated into over 50 foreign languages. And we have visitors at Orchard House who come from all over the world, and we've heard stories from all over the world. Some of them are astonishing, that what Little Women has done to encourage women whose culture does not support being a fully realized human.
So it's still relevant today, that book, no matter
Very,
how many centuries ago it was written.
very much so. And I think that it's also so relevant today because so much of the book deals with something that is dear to just about every human's heart, which is your friendships, your family, love, goodness. Those are qualities which I know not everybody perhaps can identify, but the vast majority of the human population cares deeply about their family, cares deeply about their friends, finds inspiration and hope when anyone is kind, is helping someone less fortunate. And that's all over Little Women. It's how they live, and it's how the Alcotts lived as well. The marches, the story where the marches give away their breakfast
Yes.
on Christmas morning. That's a true story, although it was actually New Year's Day, because that's the day when the Alcott family had their big breakfast. But that is actually something they did. Their mother had been called away. People knew that if somebody was in real trouble and nobody knew what to do, go see Mrs. Alcott. She'll figure it out. And she was that kind of person. They had really done that. They had really searched for Mrs. Alcott. She really went to this very struggling family, and they had a dire situation. She comes back and talks to the girls, and they choose to give their breakfast away. And, it's amazing how they live their lives.
And one of my another favorite quote of mine is that Louisa supposedly said, and you could tell me if she really said it, "I'd rather be a free spinster and paddle my own canoe."
Yes, she
Is
did.
that her quote? Yes.
She did.
And she certainly did paddle her own canoe.
Yes. And I think, again, from what I can gather, it wasn't that she thought, oh, I'd never marry. Marriage is horrible. It's just that she could see the constraints. And unless you were absolutely head over heels, so that you had the situation her younger sister had, May, who was actually Abigail May Alcott, but she chooses in her teenage years to go by her middle name, May. She's the youngest. She's Amy in Little Women. She marries a young man who believes in her art. He would rather see a well-executed painting than a fabulous meal when he would come home at night. So it was possible to find that kind of support in a marriage and have that relationship. I think Louisa would have had nothing against that if that had fallen into her life. But she didn't ever meet that person. And she, as you pointed out, had to earn money. She was very duty bound. She just believed in doing all she could to help. And she just fell into that role and stayed with it.
Now, did she end up raising one of her nieces?
Yes, the very one I just talked about, May Alcott, marries, and they have an agreement. Ernest Niericker, May's husband, was 15 years younger than May and just starting out in business. And I think it was so common. They certainly didn't expect anything to happen, but it was so common that a woman might lose her life during childbirth. So they agreed. She asked Ernest, and he agreed if anything would happen to May, the child would be sent to be raised by Louisa. And I think there were several reasons. One is what I've already touched on, that here's this very young man getting started in business. It would be hard for him to now try to bring up a child. But also, May had been gone for a number of years. Her family missed her. She missed them. I think she had that sense too, that if she didn't survive, that child would bring her family so much comfort. Marmee was already dead. And Beth, of course, as you know, in Little Women, she dies early, and that's true in their real lives. And then Marmee had died just before, not just before, but soon before May married. She had met Ernest, but they hadn't fully developed their relationship quite when Marmee died. That was in 1877. So when May does die, when the baby is 6 weeks old, they named this little girl baby Louisa May Niericker. And of course, expecting she was going to live and it would be a wonderful thing. And Louisa May Alcott would come and visit. And I mean, this was all so hopeful. And May dies 6 weeks after the baby's born, and they make the arrangements, and Ernest keeps his word. And little Lulu, as she is called, then comes to the United States to be raised by Louisa. Anna also does a great deal of the child care because Louisa's doing a lot of writing, but Louisa was constantly involved. And Bronson Alcott was still alive too. And little Lulu adored her grandfather and adored her Louisa and her Anna as well.
Now, are there any descendants still living?
Yes, yes. There are descendants through Anna and through Lulu, through May. And
I want to get back to her life as a writer, because she obviously achieved such great fame as soon as, especially with Little Women. How did she deal with that? And was she somebody who went out and did the writer thing? Did she go do readings? Did she do lectures or anything like that?
No, she did not want to do any of that sort of thing. In fact, she felt that it was frustrating that people could figure it out so easily where she lived. A lot of people knew that it was based, that the book was based on her family. People would knock on her door and want her autograph. She wrote one time that she had had 28 applications for an autograph so far that week. And she said, of all sad words, the saddest are these to an author's ear: an autograph, please. So she didn't like it. She thought of people who had achieved some level of fame, writers and others, as now lions, and these were the lion hunters, and she was not happy about that. And she could remember being in her garden around Orchard House with one of her nephews, and here's a reporter sitting on the fence sketching away. So they didn't have today's paparazzi with cameras, but they did it with sketching, and she didn't like it. She just didn't like it. It was too intrusive.
So clear up a rumor for me that I have read myriad times throughout my life, that Louisa May Alcott, there's always talk about these writer feuds. This writer doesn't like that writer. Louisa May Alcott and Mark Twain. Rumor has it she did not like Mark Twain and actually commented on his work as being profane. Is this true or false?
That is false. But I'll tell you why that rumor got started. As you know, Huck Finn was very controversial, Tom Sawyer. And there was a library committee in Concord, Massachusetts, reviewing that book. Not reviewing it for publication, I mean, looking at it. Are we going to carry this book? And one of the members of the library committee made the comment that you're making. And I don't have the exact quote, but it's something like, our little lads and lasses should not be subjected to such terrible language or something. I'm not quoting it exactly, but it was that effect. It was definitely disapproving. And it was a library committee person in Concord, Massachusetts. Now, Louisa was still alive, but it was she was not well. And she was, in fact, most likely at that time living with her physician, who was running what today you'd sort of call a nursing home. She was not in good health. She was certainly not on the library committee. She was not the one who made that comment, but it was someone from Concord, and it's just so much juicier to say it was her.
Yeah, and I believed it. I believed it. See, don't believe everything you read.
Widely believed. It is widely believed, but unless you know enough about her circumstance in that year when it was said, and the fact that, yes, it was a library person in Concord, but she wasn't on the library committee, unless you know all of that, which who's going to know that? If you hear a rumor like that, you don't know any of that.
Because she herself, didn't she, under a pseudonym, wasn't some of her work a little bit racy for the time?
Oh, very much so.
I mean,
yes.
she wrote about lust, and she wrote about, very controversial topics under a pseudonym.
She called these her blood and thunder tales. And she wrote them early on, before Little Women, to try to make money. And there were these papers that would take them, these newspapers, but they wouldn't publish them under a woman's name. That would be scandalous. I mean, women, first of all, shouldn't be writing for publication. Secondly, shouldn't be writing trash like that. So she had to come up with a pseudonym that sounded like a man, and that was A.M. Barnard.
So why do you think Louisa May Alcott is still relevant? We're in the 21st century. We're still talking about her. We're still reading Little Women and her other books. We're still visiting Orchard House.
Well, I think we've touched a little bit on some of the reasons. The fact that she was bold to do things that were not considered safe. Now, I don't mean that she was risking in a ridiculous way. It was the kind of risk that's good to take in life, where you're risking someone's disapproval, but you're staying true to who you are inside. That kind of risk can be very difficult for people still. And so there was that there was that role model that she was providing. Also, the values of just caring about other people more than you care about material things, and more than you care about, other, prestigious things that you could, seem more important or something. She just cut through all of that and was able to show people through the actions of the March girls, which were really the actions of the Alcott girls. And the Alcotts did even more than you read about in Little Women, much more. And I'll touch on that in a minute, which is a lot of why people love coming to Orchard House, because they hear about the real people and they think, my goodness, this is even more so. But that is a value that is uplifting to people. It inspires people, and it helps them believe, well, maybe I can do that. Maybe I can be my best self. And at the same time, you see these March girls, the whole March family, flawed. And that's good too, because if you read about somebody who is just so good and that's all they are, they're just perfect, you think, yeah, well, that's not me. And you're not going to feel as empowered. But you see these girls struggling. You see Jo with her temper. You see Meg going through this vain period. She wants to have the best clothes, and you see them all struggling in their various ways and finding a way to keep going anyway, to be told, and then to live the idea that you keep going and don't worry about being perfect, but do all the good you can in all the ways that you can. I mean, that's really what I think people find so inspiring about much of Louisa's writing. And one of the reasons, as I say, that they love coming to Orchard House is hearing even more. In Little Women, there's no talk of the Underground Railroad. That would have been a very risky thing to write about. It was still dangerous to admit that you had been part of the Underground Railroad for decades, because people were upset that was my property. You bankrupted me because you took away all my property. Those slaves were mine, So she doesn't put that in Little Women, but the family was part of the Underground Railroad. They took in abused women who had no place to go. They just really put themselves out there all the time in the best possible way.
Would she be shocked to know that people are still reading her books today, that they've survived into the 21st century?
Maybe she would. I mean, in a way, if she could hear what we're talking about now, she probably would say, oh, well, that makes sense. They're still struggling. These people are still struggling in a lot of ways with what we were struggling with. But I have a feeling that they would have thought that, that far into the future, probably things are going to be worked out better. And, maybe this kind of inspiration wouldn't be so necessary. So I think that might surprise her.
So we've talked a lot about Little Women, and we have about 15 minutes left. So I was wondering if you could show us a little bit about some of the movie, the photographs of the movie that you have. You have a little slideshow.
Sure. And this is a good moment to sort of also talk about what you just talked about, the fact that it's still so popular. This movie that Greta Gerwig just made, the most recent Little Women, was so highly anticipated and so popular right away. And it still is, even though it's not in theaters, that people are buying it.
I have the DVD.
And they're streaming it. And, so that again is a testament to how important that story is. And there are families that want to watch the movie every Christmas. It's sort of their Christmas story. And the 94 version with Winona Ryder is still very popular. The June Allison and Katharine Hepburn versions from much earlier are still important, especially to people who are older who remember growing up with those movies. It's sort of whatever edition you grew up with, you sort of want to still watch. But the newest one was so interesting. And then there was one done on PBS as a miniseries, and that was, I thought, well done as well. So think of all these Little Women movies, and people are buying them all. We carry them all at Orchard House, and it's just amazing the number of visitors we get, how excited they are to be there. Some of them come with tears in their eyes. It's a pilgrimage to them. It really is for a lot of people. And our staff is so enthusiastic. And we were highly involved. The house and my own involvement was important during the film. I was even an extra in the Greta Gerwig movie. So that was really fun. So let's see if I can do the screen share, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of it. Let's see. Okay, it says that you have disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh.
So you have to enable it. That was probably before when we tested it out and then you took it off.
Okay.
Shall we see?
I put it on.
Let's see if it works now. Oh, still says it's disabled.
Technology, right?
I know. I think Louisa would be a little dismayed by this.
Yeah.
Although she embraced everything new. She was very ready to move forward with all kinds of what you could say the newest thing.
Are you able to hit the share screen button at all?
When I hit it, it says,
oh, okay,
disabled participant screen sharing. That's why.
Oh, okay.
Do it. So did you, that little button that you pressed before that says
yeah
share,
I did do that. It's not doing that. It's not working for some reason.
It won't let you do that.
I wonder if it's because we're recording now and there's something different. I wonder if that may be.
Oh, maybe. Huh.
But maybe we could come back someday and do another video of just that and talk about Little Women. But in the meantime, can you tell us a little about Orchard House and what people can expect when they come? I have been there and it's well worth the trip. Beautiful house, wonderful tour.
Well, thank you. It's amazing that the house is still the way they left it. The actual structure, people didn't take part of it off or add on. It's the configuration they had and what's inside. Most of what you see really belonged to them and was used by them. And of course, that desk that Bronson built where Louisa sat and wrote the Little Women words, people love that desk. So that's one thing that people can expect. Because of COVID, we changed how we're doing things a little bit, but it's worked out very well. People seem extremely happy with this. When they first arrive, they check in to say that they're there. You can make a reservation if you want to, or you can be a walk-in. Then they go into the School of Philosophy, which is an adult education building that Bronson Alcott dreamed of and had built. He ran one of the earliest adult education programs in this country from that space. And many famous people lectured there. Ralph Waldo Emerson lectured there. Henry David Thoreau's papers were read posthumously there. Presidents of universities at the time lectured there. Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And some of the attendees were very famous too, like Emma Lazarus, who wrote the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your yearning masses, huddled masses, yearning to be free. I'm paraphrasing boldly. So that was an important building. And so people are able to go in that building. They see a short video. It's less than half an hour. And then they come down and go through all the rooms. So that way they've learned a great deal about what they're going to see. They're sort of oriented to the rooms. They sort of get a little preview of what the rooms look like, so that when they come into the house, it's much more familiar and they're not stuck standing and listening for a longer time, which is what we had also done. And that way, if there's concerns about COVID, we can move a little faster and they still see everything and they still have all the information. But it's by guided tour because everything's out in the open. You're just walking right into the rooms. There are no cords or, ribbons or anything to keep you apart. So it feels like the Alcotts just stepped out the door. Many people say that. And they also say it feels like they're walking through the book, because not only did Louisa May Alcott write Little Women there, but she set the story as if they had always lived there. It was easier to do that than to put in all those moves. So people can expect to have a wonderful guide. Our staff, I just think they are the best because they're all passionate about this and they love meeting people. And sometimes we have a chance to chat a little bit and hear the stories of the people who come. It's like I say, it's like a little community is formed just for that time that you're visiting. It feels like more than just random people standing there. They feel kind of like a community.
And is all the furnishings and everything, is that all authentic? Was that theirs?
Their furnishings, yes. Now, there are a few things that people see. This house became a museum in 1911 was when they were putting it together. 1912 it officially opened, but it was already being shown somewhat in 1911. That's over 100 years ago. And that's one reason we have so much, because those two boys that said, "We'd let you vote Aunt Weedy," those are Anna's boys, they're still alive when that's becoming a museum. They have all the stuff. They don't really want it in their home. So they give things back, and people continue to give us things back if there's something that they ended up with. And now they say, you really should have it at Orchard House. So that's why we have so much. But some items that are likely theirs, really were theirs, aren't as well documented. So we have a system. Provenance 1 means we know it was theirs. Here's a picture of Louisa sitting at that spot, or here's the actual lamp that and the note that went with it or something. So that's Provenance 1. And then we have Provenance 2, which is very likely, but we don't have the hard evidence, and it goes on like that. So most of the items are Provenance 1. They really belong to the Alcotts. And then a number of things are Provenance 2, very likely were theirs.
And the background in this video for you, that's Louisa's actual bedroom that we're seeing?
Yes, yes.
Wonderful. And what are the hours that people could come to Orchard House?
I'm going to tell everyone to be sure to go to our website, because we're open year round. We aren't seasonal. We don't close for the winter. We're open year round, but the hours change a little bit depending on the season. So you'd want to go on our website, which is really easy to remember if you know how to spell Louisa May Alcott, because that's all you need, louisamayalcott.org. But you do have to spell Louisa May Alcott right. As you know, some people don't know it's M-A-Y. They think it's M-A-E. And maybe they might think it's Louise and not Louisa. And they may not put the right number of L's and T's in Alcott. So you just want to spell it right. And that's our website. And that way you'll know the month that you're coming, what the hours are. Right now it's 11 to 3 this
Okay.
time of year, right now. But it's open longer hours at certain other times.
So Jan Turnquist, thank you so much for being here and for this wonderful conversation.
It is a pleasure. I love sharing this information.
And we love
All of-
hearing about her, about Louisa May Alcott, things that we probably, a lot of viewers may not have even known.
Well, there's so much to know. We joke and say, you know, if we had sleeping bags in a week, we could just keep going.
Thank you again. And anybody out there watching, please go visit Orchard House. I've been there. It is well worth the trip.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
And that concludes another episode of Tea with Tara. Again, I want to thank my very special guest, Jan Turnquist, and what a wonderful conversation this has been. And like I said, if you can get out to Orchard House in Concord, Massachusetts, please do so. It is well worth the trip. You will not be sorry. So until next time, happy writing.